Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 44. In this week's episode, I want to talk about personal goals and perception of family. Before we get into this week's episode, I do just want to address that I will be a bit nasally throughout this episode. I haven't been feeling 100% the last few days. I've been feeling a little under the weather, so bear with me if things get a little raspy or if I've got the sniffles throughout this episode. I'm so excited to talk about this. This was another one of your suggestions for this season of the podcast, and there's really so much to get into. So I think it's right that we fight the sniffles and that we talk about it anyway. So let's get into it. I want to start off by talking about personal goals, sort of pre-realizing our trauma versus post-realizing our trauma. And when I was a kid, I would say up until around age 15 or so, my second half of high school was when I sort of leaned into my friend group a little bit more, and I was starting to taste independence, I think, for the first time. But up until that age, I think my personal goals, they looked very good on paper. They were very sort of traditional, communal almost. I think they involved my family and what they wanted a lot of the time. They, looking back, felt more surface level. I think I had certain academic goals. I always wanted to do well in school. I would enter into different competitions. I think I always pushed myself in that way, both because I enjoyed a challenge and I felt like I was capable of it. And also, I think because I knew that excelling in that way would make my parents proud. And that's nothing new, sort of craving our parents' approval, wanting to make them proud. That was of paramount importance for me throughout my childhood. And in terms of sort of bigger life goals, I always thought that I would grow up to live a life similar to that of my parents. I would grow up and get married and have a family, have kids. I thought I would be working for an interior design firm in Manhattan, just sort of very traditional. And I always thought that I would stick around and stay close to home so that I could be around and take care of my parents as they got older. And so that always kind of felt like my path. That seemed like what my goals were. And what's interesting about this, looking back on it now, is the difference between internalizers and externalizers and how that relates to personal goals. In Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, Lindsay Gibson talks about how externalizers tend to look for things in the outside world, things outside of themselves to change in order for their personal lives to get better. And so I think it's common for emotionally immature people to be externalizers. They're kind of looking for these external factors or circumstances to change. And if or when those things do change, then these other aspects of their lives will kind of follow suit and fall in line and things will be better. And what's really interesting, I think, about my goals at that time when I was younger, before I had realized all of my trauma, was that they were sort of external. They were a job. They were a family, having kids. They were moving out and buying a house and sort of these things outside of myself that I thought would have informed my personality and the way that I felt about myself, how successful maybe I felt. And I think that's really sort of an interesting connection to have those sort of personal goals while also being raised by an emotionally immature parent who displayed similar characteristics to that of an externalizer, where if things weren't going well, it was always someone or something else's fault. And if that thing or if that person would change and do something differently, then all of these other things would be better. And I think one of the biggest differences, sort of transformations in my personal goals now, sort of post-realizing my trauma, is that my goals are so much more personal. They're so much closer to me, and they're not necessarily tied to external circumstances. And I think that that's a really wonderful thing for me. I think it's allowed me to focus on things that I do have control over. And I think it's sort of become one of those things where now it's more about the version of me that's achieving my goals rather than the specific goals themselves. And I think what that allows me to do, one of the things that allows me to do, is allow myself and allow my goals the freedom to evolve as I grow and change, as my priorities shift, as I get older. When I was younger, one of my sort of bucket list goals was to travel across the country. I wanted to take a cross-country road trip, and I was very big into van life when I was 16 or 17 years old. It was just kind of making its way onto my Instagram feed. And as someone who loves the outdoors, and for as sheltered as I was, I think I loved being adventurous. I thought this is the perfect thing for me. I would love to do this. And I remember sort of bringing it up sometimes as I was getting older and I got my license and I was kind of getting closer to an age where something like that would actually be feasible for me. And despite the fact that it was a personal goal of mine, it made my parents uncomfortable. It wasn't something that maybe they fully understood or that they wanted me to do. They wouldn't have been directly involved, and so it wouldn't have benefited them in any way. And so whenever I would bring it up and talk about it, it was kind of met with hesitation or negativity. There was never any real encouragement or, okay, let's talk about this. Why do you want to do this? Can we help you? Let's make a plan. What is this going to look like? It always kind of just seemed like this far off thing that no one besides me would actually entertain. And so I think another big difference for me in terms of my personal goals after moving out of my parents' house is that I feel like I'm actually allowed to have them. And I don't have to feel selfish or guilty for wanting to do things that maybe only I want to do, that maybe only benefit me. They don't have to be communal goals that benefit everyone that's in my life, and that's okay. I think so much of my focus now is living a sustainable life, not only in a physical sense, maybe with the food that I eat or the way that I live my life on the day to day, but I think also emotionally. And that is one of the reasons that I'm so committed to this healing journey and to understanding more about mental health and my trauma, because I want to be able to face or approach any kind of situation and to feel grounded and to feel confident in my ability to face it and to process those emotions. And I think, like I said earlier, that's why now my personal goals feel more about who I am as I'm sort of achieving these things and setting these goals than the specific goals themselves. That for me has been such a big part of healing that's been so beneficial in my personal life, my day-to-day life, is sort of developing this ability to remain level-headed and a bit more objective rather than emotional. And I think I've achieved a level of inner peace that wouldn't have been possible if I were still existing in a toxic environment. And so that, I think, has kind of been the biggest shift for me in terms of personal goals. I think before realizing my trauma, while I was still living with my parents and I was a bit younger, my goals were very much external. And I thought that things in my life would change when these things outside of myself would change. That's when things would be better or different. Those things kind of defined success for me. And now my personal goals are so much closer to home, where if I face a situation that at one point would have been so overwhelming and stressful, and I move through it gracefully and with compassion, and it doesn't kind of sit with me in a negative way like it would have in the past, because I've developed these tools and these skills to process these emotions and to understand where they come from so that they no longer have that power over me. I feel proud in those moments. I think those are the things that make me feel like, wow, I'm doing it. It doesn't matter necessarily what's going on externally. I think it's so much more to do with what's going on within yourself. It all stems from there. And if you have a good handle on that and a good understanding of that, then I think everything else is sort of secondary and becomes just a little bit easier. So that is kind of my take on personal goals. And I do think that that might be sort of a shared experience amongst a lot of us, to kind of turn our goals inward and to focus on ourselves, because that will inevitably trickle down to all of the things that are going on externally outside of ourselves in our lives. And then we've got perception of family. This is something that I wanted to tack on to this topic because it seemed to go sort of hand in hand with it. And it's something that I've been thinking about recently. And I think, realizing your trauma and distancing yourself from unhealthy behavior, from unhealthy relationships, can really alter your perception of your family and where you come from, and also of yourself. For a long time, one of the things that I think is so interesting, not only about emotionally immature parents, but I think more specifically narcissistic parents, about a narcissistic person in general, is how charismatic and charming they can be to people outside of their immediate family. On the surface, they are so social and fun to be around. They are talented in certain ways, and they know how to sort of get on someone's good side and to have a conversation flow really easily. Maybe they remember things about people to make them feel special, or they go out of their way, sort of above and beyond, to do a favor for someone. And for so long, I felt like in my young life, my family was sort of this picture perfect family in my community. I felt like a lot of people knew my parents, they knew my siblings. My parents were very involved in the community when I was younger. And, it was one of those situations where so many people, teachers and peers alike, would tell me how much they love my parent and how lucky I am to have parents like I do. And we've talked about that and how that can sort of contribute to the confusion that you feel as a child when you're being told how lucky you are and how amazing your parents are. And yet behind the scenes, there are a lot of things that are happening that don't make you feel very good. But I sort of felt like I understood my role in maintaining my family's image. I felt like I always had to do the right thing. I felt like as a whole, I guess our family, we did well. We did what we were supposed to do. We volunteered. We went out of our way to help other people. We were polite and respectful, which looking back now, I think translated to me as a child being obedient and complacent. But other people would kind of admire our family dynamic and compliment it. And so I felt like I had a certain responsibility, not only personally, I guess within my home life with my immediate family, but also in a bit more of a public or a social way to live up to these expectations of my family and to play my part in maintaining that image. And so I always went out of my way to do the right thing. I was well behaved in school and respectful of authority figures, of adults. I rarely, if ever, asked any questions or caused any problems. I was very much aware of my behavior and of other people's perceptions of me from a very, very young age. And I think this also kind of feeds into my perception of myself as I'm starting to kind of look back and reflect on this at this time in my life as an adult myself, knowing what I know now. And I think what's so interesting is that part of me, when I was younger, felt proud to be a part of my family unit because of the image that we had amongst other people, because of other people's perceptions of us. I remember feeling like I was kind of proud of where I came from because, I come from a good family and we do the right things. And, we were kind of admired by some people or complimented by some people. And I wanted to fit into that. I wanted to play my part, I guess. And I felt like because that was where I came from, that I had the ability to do that. This is a part of me. This is who I am. And I think what's really interesting is that my narcissistic parent would praise me consistently. And not always. I say consistently because it was when I was on my parents' good side. It was when I was doing things that my parent wanted me to do or saying things that my parent wanted me to say. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, you learn very quickly that it feels much better to do what your narcissistic parent wants versus doing what you want to do and risk upsetting your parent. You learn that very quickly, as did I. And so I think so much of my behavior and my personality became molded to my parent. I think I was consistently mirroring them, and I was consistently getting positive reinforcement when I would do those things. And so that just sort of reinforced that behavior and made it that much more of a normal part of my life, of my day-to-day. And it feels great. It feels great when you feel like your parent is proud of you, like you're doing well, when they're complimenting you and telling you that, you're smart or that you're capable or whatever it might be. And for me personally, I was picked on throughout school. I was bullied throughout school. I think it was partially to do with my social isolation. I think it was partially to do with how fearful I was of making mistakes and how that sort of fed into my academic performance, and always sort of being at the top of my class and respectful of my teachers. I think I very much had the teacher's pet kind of reputation. And so I think for me, a lot of that praise that I would receive from my parent, I might have used as almost a coping mechanism for bullying, because I wanted to believe that I was a good person. And, in school, I didn't always feel that way. As a result of my peers, I think I was respected by my teachers and I really enjoyed our relationships. But when it came to my peers, I didn't feel that camaraderie. And so I think for me, it was kind of a way to be like, I don't really care about what these people have to say, because I'm smart and I'm going to do all of these great things in life. And, I can do this, that, and the other thing. I was in the good graces of my parent. And, in hindsight, it resulted in isolation. I think there was a bit of favoritism even to gain my loyalty. And I don't think the way that you help a child who is maybe enduring bullying or is having a harder time socially is by trash talking their peers and by saying, oh, don't worry about them. They're never going to do anything great in life. You're so much better than they are. You're so much smarter than they are. I think that narrative was so consistent throughout my time in elementary school that it really drove a wedge between myself and my peers. But being in the position that I was in, not feeling that camaraderie, being picked on and being bullied, it truly was, I think, a way for me to cope. But looking back, I think it benefited my parent. And it wasn't until I was an adult myself that I was able to kind of look back at the language that was used, at the conversations, and understand that that is not the way to help a child become more social or to integrate themselves into friend groups or to help them cope and deal with bullying or being picked on. It was a way for my parent to manipulate me and to isolate me from people my age, from other family members, so that I felt like it was my parent and I against the world, so that this undying loyalty was kind of brought into the relationship. And, it's really unfortunate. I think as we kind of move through our healing journeys, coming to terms with something like this and altering our perception of our family and where we come from and ourselves, the person that we thought we were throughout childhood, can raise a lot of questions in terms of our sense of self and our identity. I remember thinking when I started kind of getting into this topic and reframing my perception of my family and myself while I was still living at home, was I really that person? Did I have all of these characteristics? Was I as good as my parents said? Was I so different from my peers? And I think what can be so challenging about asking yourself those questions is the direct connection maybe between a lot of the praise that you received and the positive reinforcement that you received and the manipulation of your parent. the ways that now, maybe as an adult who's a bit more informed, who has a better understanding of what's going on, you can see the motive behind those words and behind those actions. And I think, it's common for us to not remember every single aspect of our childhood, or especially, I think, being raised in that kind of environment when so much of our energy and focus is on another person, to really feel like we have a good grasp on who we were, on our personality and our characteristics throughout that time. I think so many of us sort of rely on our parents to tell us who we are, especially as we get older. I think a bit of a side note, but that is one of the really difficult things for me personally to reconcile in going no contact with my parents and just sort of coming to terms with the situation and not having the relationship with them that I always thought I would, is not being able to go to them, the people who were grown adults throughout my childhood, and be able to ask them, what was I like? And to hear an honest version of that. And so I think we're sometimes left to fill in those gaps as best we can on our own. And sometimes we can't. And so sometimes all we can do is kind of sit with what we know and start to form our identity and sense of self now. So it can be a really sort of jarring experience, I think, to go from, I was once a part of this family unit, growing up and feeling proud of where you come from and feeling like you have a certain standard or expectation to live up to and to uphold, to feel like you play a part in that. And that it's something that you're proud of because other people are, complimenting you. They're making you feel like this is something that you should be proud of. To now sort of realizing your trauma and understanding that so much of what you had grown accustomed to, so much of what you believed to be normal and that you were proud of, there's so much beneath that wasn't actually what it seemed on the surface throughout childhood. And so now it's like I'm not necessarily a part of this family dynamic anymore, and it's not something that I'm proud of. I'm almost proud to have distanced myself from this. And that can be such a shift to no longer feel that sense of pride from where you came from, and to no longer feel like you have a place or like you truly fit in with your family dynamic. It can almost make you feel like a failure, which I think, especially when you're going through a more challenging time, can be a really easy thing to just kind of accept and to tell yourself and to believe. Once you start to realize that, maybe your childhood wasn't as great as you thought it was. Maybe your parents weren't as great as you thought they were. It can prompt us to question and to ask ourselves, was I as great as I thought I was? Am I as great as I think I am? Can I be great? And I think it's so important to remember that you are not defined by what you endured in your past. You have the ability to sort of redefine what your life looks like moving forward. I think so often we can sort of feel alone and isolated as we come to terms with all of these things and we have these realizations, which is one of the many reasons that I enjoy and look forward to sitting down every week and talking about these things, because you're not alone. As alone as you might feel personally, there are so many other people out there who are going through something so similar. And I think sometimes the only way for us to feel that sense of community is to be vulnerable with our stories and to share with one another. And I think in that, there is a lot of strength that can sort of help us to move forward. One of the last things that I want to touch on when it comes to perception is the freedom that you can feel as you sort of release yourself from these expectations and from the pressure to maintain this image that maybe your family has for itself, that your parents have crafted and worked so hard to maintain. I think for so long throughout my childhood, I was expected to be respectful and polite, which translated to compliant and obedient. I was always expected to do my best and to excel at everything that I did and to never make mistakes, to always do the right thing. And something that I have worked on consistently, that I'm still working on, is understanding that to be human is to be flawed, and that there are times when we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. And I think sometimes distancing ourselves from this unhealthy behavior and sort of changing our perception of our family as we start to understand more about our childhood and our trauma, it can kind of release you from these expectations in a way that allows you to be yourself. And you can sort of develop this ability to treat yourself with compassion and with grace as you figure out who that is and how to do that. And you may no longer feel tied down by these expectations or by these standards, because it's no longer your responsibility to keep up the act, to sort of maintain this facade. And that can be so exhausting, especially when those characteristics or those parts of your personality are not true to you. They aren't in line with your authentic self. And so you're consistently pretending to be a version of yourself that's more agreeable or more favorable or more aligned with your family's values. I think sometimes understanding that your parents are not these all-knowing figures, that your parents are just people trying to figure life out also, and that maybe all of these things that you believe to be so and to be true and to be right throughout your childhood aren't actually. You can start to define those things for yourself, and you can start to live a life that's much more aligned with who you truly are and the kind of life that you want to live moving forward. And so I think as much as there's sadness that can sometimes surround your newfound perception of your family and yourself throughout childhood, sort of where you come from, your roots, I think there can also be a sense of relief that comes over you. And for me, there's also been a bit of pride, I think. I think understanding the emotional immaturity that I grew up around and the unhealthy behavior that I was subject to throughout so much of my childhood, it makes me feel sometimes even more proud to be where I'm at now, because I am not continuing the cycle. I am not using my trauma as an excuse for bad behavior. I am using it as sort of motivation to be a better, more emotionally mature, self-aware version of myself and to live a more sustainable life. All the while understanding that I have faced and overcome so many challenges that there have been times, and there are still, where I feel like I'm playing catch up, but I'm overcoming these challenges in my own time, which again, I think is something so important to emphasize when it comes to healing from any kind of trauma, is that there truly is no timeline, and it is different for everyone. But I think as you start to overcome these challenges and to become more in touch with your sense of self and your identity and learn who you truly are, you start to feel proud of yourself and where you are, maybe not necessarily because of where you come from, but despite where you come from. I think that is a really wonderful thing, and I think that that's something that you should allow yourself to lean into, sort of recognizing that you might have had sort of a longer, more convoluted road than some, and how it might have been a little bit more challenging for you to get to a place where you feel like you should be at the age that you're at. But despite those challenges, you're here and you're doing it, and you're making a consistent effort to show up for yourself and in turn for the people around you. And every single one of us, I think, should be applauded for making that consistent effort, because it's really hard work and it doesn't really stop. So I applaud you for that. And with that, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I will be back next week, hopefully not sounding quite so under the weather, with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast.